All right, in this video, we're going to learn all about debugging. There's kind of like two parts of debugging. There's tools that you can use to like get some good info as to what happened when things go wrong. And then there's sort of a mindset of like, how do I tackle this thing? How do I be a good problem solver? So this video is going to be all about the tools. And then what I hope you're going to learn over the rest of the course is anytime we sort of hit a roadblock, I'm not going to cut it out of the videos. I'm going to leave it in and sort of show you my thought process as to, this doesn't work. I'm going to sort of step through what my process would be to figuring out why it went wrong. So what I want you to do is go into your exercise folder. There's a folder 16 debugging. And then inside of that, there is a debugging start.js and a debugging.html. If you look at the debugging.html, pretty simple. We load up our base CSS. I have a button that says make me bigger. And then I'm loading in this debugging.js. That doesn't exist yet. What I need you to do is to go ahead and save a copy of this as just debugging.js. Now, this debugging is going to contain a bunch of stuff we haven't learned yet. This is what's called an array of objects. This is a loop. These are some functions. There's doctorize. You probably know what these do. This is some button event listeners. It doesn't matter that we don't know what these do yet. This is a fetch function. I'll explain what they do, and then we'll learn about how to build our own. This is just more so that we can get into the different types of debugging. So let's start at probably the most basic, and that is your console methods are going to be helpful for learning how they all work. So there's obviously console.log. That's probably the most common one. You see that I'm using console log here. Let's go into this people.forEach, which usually gives you like a little question mark there. Looks like it's not there anymore. It usually gives you a little eye and a circle. So that one doesn't do really anything all that different. There's console.error. Now this is not for actually throwing errors or handling errors. We're going to learn about that. This just changes what it looks like in the console. So often, like maybe if you were to tell a person like if the person.name is equal to Wes, then console.error dumb name. And you just see dumb name, and it will both give you this sort of UI as well as it gives you this, which is called a stack trace. We'll learn about that in just a second when we get to this call stack thing here. There's console.warn, which is very similar. Just gives you the exact same thing, but with a exclamation mark instead of an actual error UI. There is console.table. I really like that one. So let's go down here, console.table, and we have all these people. Anytime you have a list of objects and the objects have the same property, meaning that this one has a name, a cool, and a country, console.table will format it in a nice little table that you have there. I like that a lot. Be able to peer into the data that you have really easily. There is console.count. So if we were to, let's go into this doctorize, and let's just say console.count, running doctorize. And you wanted to know like how many times is this function actually being run. So if I go in here and I run doctorize, it's Wes running doctorize 1, 2, 3, 4. So every time I run that console.count, passing it the string of running doctorize, that will show me the info. And that can be helpful for maybe sometimes you have a function that's accidentally running twice, or you don't know, like sometimes you are working with like hover elements and it's triggering way too often. Console.count will show you how many times it's running. Similarly, I think you can also pass in variables. So if we were to change this to backticks, running doctorize for name. And now if I were to run doctorize, it says running doctorize for Wes 1, doctorize for Wes 2. But if I were to then change that to Snickers, that goes back to 1. And then if I run Wes again, it still maintains that. So it's based on what string you pass to console.count. Next one we have is console.group. That can be helpful if you've got a whole bunch of like stuff to console.log. So let's get rid of this, or I'll comment that out. Make a function here. Function do a lot of stuff. And what you can do is say console.group, and you can just say doing some stuff. And then inside of here, you can do as many console logs as you want. Like, hey, I'm one console.warn, watch out, console.log, or maybe error. Hey, console, you get the point. And then we finish it off with console.group end. And then you pass it the same string that you've used to open your group, which is here. And now when we run that, do a lot of stuff, what it does is it groups together all of these console logs into like a nice little collapsible thing. And I find that helpful. So like if you were going up to this people.forEach, let's go and clear that out. We could say console.group and say starting person.name. And then we could, let's just do group end immediately. We'll say, oh, maybe we'll just use the person's name. We don't need starting because that will show it. So console.group person's name. And then inside of that, we can console log person.country, console log the person.cool, console log done. And now when we refresh that, what you see is that because we looped over all three of these people, we've nicely tidied them into Wes, Scott, and Snickers. And you can actually even group collapsed. And that will by default just collapse them. I find that really helpful when I'm looping over lots of data. The console can become a very cluttered space. And it's nice to just tuck them into their own little groups. And I say like, oh, I'm having trouble with Scott. I'm going to open it up. And then you can actually look at the data. So I find that one to be particularly helpful when you're doing lots and lots of logging. So that's all the different console methods out there. I think there's a couple other ones, but those are the ones that I use myself quite a bit when I'm trying to debug something. I'm just going to console comment these out. Next thing we need to talk about is something called the call stack or the stack trace. The stack trace will tell you what function called what function called what function. So if I have this function down here called go, and that function in turn will call doctorize, which will first call greet. So there's kind of a lot going on here. And you notice that inside of greet, we have this function that doesn't exist, and that will cause an error. Let's go ahead and run that from our console here. So go. You see uncaught reference error doesn't exist is not defined. Okay. And then you start to see this. And I think a lot of new developers just look at this and they go, oh, that's a lot of numbers and parentheses and anonymous 1-1. What does that even mean? So they sort of just ignore it. But like, this is where the good stuff is in an error. If you want to know what went wrong, you have to get good at reading these call stacks. And it's pretty simple. It just says, okay, it happened here at greet on debugging.js on line 47. Okay, so it happened on line 47. Okay, good. That's where the actual error happened. But errors aren't always that easy. You might say like, okay, but like how did that happen? Who called greet? Well, you go into the next piece of the call stack. Okay, at go. So go ended up calling the greet function. And that was at line 52. So go to line 52. And here's the go. That's where greet actually got called. And then it says at anonymous 1-1. What does that mean? That means just because I ran it from my actual console. If I were to make another function called function bootstrap, and that in turn called go, it's console log starting the app. Now, if I were to run bootstrap, you'll see that the error was in greet, which was called by go, which was called by bootstrap, which was called by an anonymous function, meaning I ran that from the console here, right? And if I were to just run bootstrap on the page load, you see that when I refresh the page now, that immediately happens. And then it tells me the error was at greet, which was called by go, which was called by bootstrap, which was run on line 61 on here. So being able to read your call stacks as they go from one file to another is going to be extremely important, and we're going to be using that quite a bit in this course. So I'm going to just comment out this running of the Bootstrap. Everything looks good. Next thing we want to learn about is the grabbing of elements. So this is just a kind of a handy little one that I like to use quite a bit. Is if you're on a website and you're like inspecting it, like let's take this button right here. Actually, let's go to a website that has more buttons. Let's go to MDN. Let's take this input for an example right here. I want to know what's going on with this input. So if I were to select that with my DevTools, so you click on this one and you can hover over them. You want to select it. That's an input, and I can just type in like, hey, inside of it. And what is selected right here in my DevTools is blue. And then if I flip over to the console tab right here, I'm just going to clear it out. If you type $0, what that will do is it will return to you whatever you currently have selected in the Elements tab. And that can be really helpful because you can do things like call like .value against it, and it will tell you what I've typed inside of it. So I use that all the time where I'm like, I don't want to have to select the thing or make a global variable. I just like select the element in the Elements tab and then go to console and type in $0. And that's going to give you sort of a shortcut access to the actual element. You might wondering like, what does 0 mean? That means the last element clicked. So if I were to go back here and hover over top of this submit button, well, it's actually off screen. They've hidden it, but if I were to click on it and go back to console and type $0 again, you see that this is the button that we selected. And if I type $1, it gives us the input. So what happens is it says $0 is the last element you clicked on here. $1 is the second last element you clicked. And you can keep going forever. If let's click on another element here. So the span. So $0 should now be that span. $1 should now be the button, and $2 should now be the input. I'm not sure how far it goes, but that definitely can be handy to sort of have a little bit of memory of what elements you ended up clicking. So those are the $0, $1, $2. Kind of another cool thing you can do is we have $, and $, and these are only in the console. You can't use these things in your code. This is only when you're running in the console. And what these are oh, it looks like this one. If jQuery is loaded on the page, this won't work. So we need to find a website. Is jQuery on here? Yeah, this page has jQuery loaded on it. So we need to go to another. Maybe let's go to apple.com. Open up at this. And if you say $, there we go. And $. So what these are sort of shorthand selectors for two things we're going to learn about in a coming video about the DOM. And that will allow us to select things like based on the selectors. So $P will give us document.querySelector, and that will match the first thing that matches the selector here. And then $, will match all of the ones that match the selector. So in this case, it's found the first paragraph tag. And then in this case, it found all of the paragraph tags on the page. So I find those to be very helpful. We'll even look about how can you like replicate this functionality. This has nothing to do with jQuery. It's just kind of a little shorthand that's available to you in the console. Let's talk about breakpoints. That's sort of the next big one that we have here. Let's go into our people.forEach, get rid of all this console here. Let's just console log the person.name and go back to debugging. And you see everyone's name. What you can do is in here, if you want to sort of pause JavaScript from running, is you can type debugger and then have semicolon. And that is a statement that only when your DevTools are open, it will actually pause JavaScript from running, and it allows us to sort of peer into JavaScript at that very moment. So now when I refresh, what happens is we've set what's called a breakpoint. Break at this certain time. And it's kind of cool because this will give you a whole bunch of information as to what happened. I'm going to try to do my best. I might have to zoom out here a little bit. So if you hover over it, it actually shows you what the variables are equal to. You see that the JavaScript has paused. If we go to our console, nothing is logged just yet. We'll go back to the sources tab here. And then on this right-hand side, this is where all of the different tools for inspecting what's going on is happening here. So first, it gives us our call stack. We talked about that earlier. Second, it's going to tell you what our local variables are. That's coming next in our scope video. But you can see really quickly here, we've got two parameters here. We have person and we have index. And if you either look here, you can see what they are, or you can even just hover over top of them and you can see what the person variable is set to. There's other stuff for breakpoints. We'll get into there in just a second. But what's kind of cool is you can either click the play button, and what happened there, if we go back to our console, look at console logged Wes, and then it hit the debugger again because it's a loop. And now you see the person is equal to Scott. The index is equal to 1. There's other information about the this keyword. We'll learn about that in coming videos, and we can sort of like keep going with it. We can step over into the next function call. So you see what I did right there is when you hit play, that will just keep running JavaScript until it hits a next debugger. If you hit this one, step over into next function call, what it will do is allow you to run the code line by line. So here I am. It doesn't say Wes yet, but if I keep pressing, you can press the arrow up here too. Next line. Did it get console logged? Yeah, Scott got console logged. Next line, next line. You can just sort of like step through the JavaScript and you can see how the browser is actually going to go ahead and run it. So when console log becomes a little bit overwhelming, when you feel like you're console logging too much data in order to see it, or if you feel like you're trying to console log something quickly just so you can see what happened in the past, popping a debugger in there, and those can go in anywhere. I could pop them up right here and refresh the page. And you see that there are no variables available to us, but I could step into it. Now you can see there's no variables. Now you can see that I stepped over that creation here. Now we have this people variable, which has all our data in it. It's just a handy way to sort of slow things down and be able to peer into what the different pieces of data are. You can also set breakpoints from the browser as well. So if I take that debugger out, everything works just fine. But you can go into your sources tab, and in the sidebar here, you'll be able to click on your actual JavaScript that you have. This is obviously open. You can click through to other ones here, and you can say like, okay, when someone runs this go function, I want to put a breakpoint in there. And what I just did there is I just clicked on the line number, and now when I refresh the page, you'll see that that actually has stopped a breakpoint. And when I refresh the page, you see the breakpoint is still there. Now, if I were to go ahead and run that function, you see that it pauses itself in debugger. We can see, look at this. The name is not, you can see it's paused itself in the debugger, and we have all of the exact same info that we were looking at earlier. So breakpoints, you can either click on the line from the sources tab, or you can pop the word debugger anywhere in your JavaScript. Just make sure you actually remove those. I once forgot a debugger command in, which is not a big deal, because like if you refresh the page and there's no dev tools open, it won't do anything. The browser will just ignore them. But I was working on a developer focused website, which many developers just have their dev tools open by default. And that was a bad day. So we had to quickly take it out. So make sure you remove all of those. We talked about scope. Scope will allow us to sort of peer into what variables are. We'll look a little bit more into that in the next video. Next one is network requests. If you want to see like what is being fired off, if you open up your dev tools and you go to your network tab and you refresh, you're going to see what's happening here is you see all of the different files that were needed in order for this thing to work. So we have our debugging.html. We have our base.css. This is all the CSS that I've made this blue and pink button. We've got our debugging.js. And then we have an SVG, which is this little wavy pattern in the background here. And this can be really helpful because you can actually see when a website is sending out data for you. So I've got this little function right here called fetch dad joke. And that's just going to go off to some API and grab a dad joke. We'll worry about what is a sync and all this. What does this mean in the future? We're going to learn all about that. But for now, just know that it goes to an external API and grabs a dad joke. If I were to run that dad joke function here, it brings us back a dad joke. What did the scarf say to the hat? You go on ahead. I'm going to hang around here a bit longer. Oh my gosh. So if we go to our network here, you'll see that there's this new item that's been logged here. I can click on that and you can see information about the actual request, like what happened. It's probably all not that useful to you, but you can see what the raw response was and a preview of it. This is going to be helpful when we look at JSON. It also gives you information about like how long did this request take. So if you're like, this website is slow, it'll actually tell you where the time was spent in fetching that dad joke. It took 133 milliseconds. And most of that was spent in waiting for the dad joke API to actually return the data to us. And very little of that was actually us sending the request out. So that's helpful. I really like using that. Like if you go to apple.com and you go to your network tab and you refresh, you can see there's literally hundreds of things that get requested here. Little American flag icon, Apple Arcade. You can also filter them here for XHR. That's when they're sending data out about you. So here there some suggestions. Find a store. There's just some data somewhere on the website. They needed this. Locale switcher. Sometimes when you like hover over things, they start sending data off, showing that, this person is interested in it. Take a quick search. If I search for iPad. Yeah, you see that these suggestions start popping up. So I just typed in iPad. Now it comes back with a list of suggestions. Here we go. The results: iPad Pro, iPad Air, regular iPad, iPad Mini, iPad accessories. And you see that that's the data that was actually returned and they displayed it into us. So being able to use this network tab and sort of peer into what is happening, what requests are being sent off to their server is kind of cool. You feel like a little bit of a hacker being able to see the raw data behind everything. That is network requests. Next one is break on attribute. I don't use this one all that often, but it can be helpful. So right here, I've got this button. And when you click it, it gets bigger. If you go to your elements, you'll see that the font size here is just being bumped up every single time that I click it. If you don't know, like if you're just looking at this right now and your project has hundreds of JavaScript files and you go like, okay, where is the JavaScript that is making this button bigger? You could spend your whole day just reading through JavaScript, or what you can do is you can go into your button and right click and you can say break on. And this is just another way of adding a breakpoint, but you can say break when somebody has an attribute modification. When somebody changes one of these attributes, throw in a breakpoint right there and pause things from actually running. So we can go ahead and break on. There's also subtree modifications. That means when somebody adds like a div, we'll look at that. And there's also node removal, meaning when somebody removes like an element or some text from something. Let's just do attribute modification. And then when I click it, you see it paused in the debugger. You can see that there's a whole bunch of information about what's going on here. It gives me the new font size. It gives me something called an event. We'll learn about all that, as well as gives us this keyword. We'll learn all about that as well. So I don't use that one all that often, but it's very helpful when you're being thrown into a random code base that you don't really know what's going on. Finally, if you go to your sources tab again, I'll just refresh this, get out of the debugger here. You'll see that there are other things here. You can throw event listener breakpoints in there. So is there like a click in here? Mouse click. So break on mouse click. And now if I just if I click on, there we go. I clicked on that button right there. And I just threw in a debugger breakpoint for you. And I could just go ahead and take them. So if you are trying to like figure out what's happening when, you can throw in breakpoints for when somebody clicks. There's also XHR breakpoints, which means that like you can click on this little one and just click escape, and that will give you any XHR or fetch. What that will do is anytime a fetch request is made, anytime someone goes off to an external API, it will break. So here, if I fetch a dad joke, you see that it pauses in the debugger, and we can actually step through it. Right now, the joke is nothing, but if I step again, there we go. Now the joke says, how does dyslexic poet write in verse? So it's kind of cool to be able to do it. You can do that on apple.com as well. Here, let me show you. Let's go to our sources tab, go to XHR breakpoints. Break on any XHR fetch. Now, if I go ahead and search for something, let me do I. You see, as soon as I typed in I, it sent off that suggestion request to us. And you'll see that we've now paused it in debugger. You can see the call stack. Like, look at this. This is all of the functions that Apple had to run in order to fetch those suggestions for you. It will also tell you some of the local variables that are in there. It'll tell you closure. We'll learn about that. So sometimes this might be a little bit over your head, but just know that we can throw in breakpoints a whole bunch of different ways, and breakpoints are a great way to pause the actual value from running. I think that is it. Yep, that is it. That's all the sort of the different debugging techniques and tips that I use through it. I would say 98% of my debugging is done both with console log, breakpoints, and network request. And then the rest of those ones, being able to peer into scope, attribute removal, those are handy in severe edge cases where I sound like, oh, this is really tough. And you just need to know about them so you can look them up when you actually need them. That's it. Let's get into the next one, which is understanding scope.